Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Donahue, Professor of American Environmental Studies at Brandeis University. We're excited to co-sponsor the latest event in the Living on Earth Book Club, the virtual event series. I've enjoyed reading Mark Bittman's new book, Animal, Vegetable, because it deals with many of the issues we wrestle with in my food and farming course, and that I've been facing for 40 or 50 years myself as a farmer. So, Mark, I think we'll be using this book in class next fall. Living on Earth is a public radio program and podcast, which has been reporting on climate change, science, and public health for the last 30 years. Here with us today is Steve Curwood, the award-winning host and executive producer of Living on Earth. Steve will be speaking with food writer Mark Bittman. Mark Bittman is the author of more than 30 books, including the How to Cook Everything series and the #1 New York Times bestseller, VB6, Eat Vegan Before 6 to Lose Weight and Restore Your Health for Good. He was a food columnist, opinion columnist, and the lead magazine food writer at the New York Times, where he started writing in 1984 and remained for more than 30 years. So, Steve, over to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Brian, for the introduction. And thank you both to Brandeis University. And let me welcome the students at Brandeis and the students at the University of Massachusetts Boston, who are also joining us on this link tonight, and the McCormick Graduate School here at UMass Boston. And thank you all for co-sponsoring this event. So as Brian mentioned, we're here today with Mark Bittman. You saw on the slide when it first came up, this is the book. Mark, we'll try to sell as many of these as we can tonight. We want your publisher to be happy. It comes with a spork, so I don't know if that means that it's going to be liquid or I'm going to get stuck. Mark is, I have to say, I much appreciate your amazing career in this. And we're going to talk about your book in a moment, but if there was one recipe or something that you put forward in 1984 that you would take back now, what would that be, do you think?
That is so funny because in the hour before we started, I was going through my folder called Some Really Old Stuff. And I really started writing about food in 1980, but I don't think I had a computer until 83 or 84. So I don't have those first, I do have them in hard copy, but I don't have those first few files in digital. So this is mostly stuff from 84 to 92 or so in this folder. And what was I just thinking about that was so embarrassing? There was just something, I'm going to answer this question seriously, so you're going to have to give me a second. Because there was something, there was there's a piece about beans, and basically the hook is that every bean recipe is better if it includes meat. So I would take that back, I think. As a part-time vegan, as someone who thinks that beans are the most important source of protein on the planet, I think I've learned how to cook beans without meat. So there you go. It's so funny that you started with that question. That's such an odd coincidence. Great.
Well, it's because obviously we're all human beings, right?
Oh, so
sorry.
yeah.
I couldn't
Okay. Well,
resist
you
that
started
one.
with the spork, and now you've moved on to that. So
It's in
I
the
know who
thing,
I'm
yeah.
talking to. Yeah.
Yeah, well, because I think, for people who may not know your work, one of the things that's really nice about it is you're so playful and, you're insightful, and this book is really deep. This is not exactly light reading,
No.
but you're really insightful and you're playful where is appropriate, on these things. And you cut us slack. Because you're looking back to when maybe you suggested you always had to have meat with beans, but all of us were in this business of, as you point out in your book, what's more essential to us than food? Yeah, of course we need oxygen. Yes, we need water, but water is also, also part of this food equation.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, we need the basics, and we spend a lot of time eating it. We spend a fair amount of time getting it. Some of us spend a fair amount of time cooking it. And it is the way that we come together socially in the way that it's been so tough to deal with this doggone pandemic, right? Because it's just so hard to get together casually and safely with friends and new friends that we're making over food. So your book is, yes, it's about food, but really you talk about the rise of civilization and inequality and colonialism and the power struggles that are so associated with, once we went to agriculture, what is that, like 10,000 years ago? So you begin, in fact, with the dawn of agriculture. So let's kick off this part of the discussion right there. Why do you say in this book that so many elements of social stratification, so many elements of power and inequality begin with the adaptation of agriculture?
Well, because before we did agriculture, actually, let me back up to one thing you said, Steve, because I think it's so important. We'll get to that. But we do think of food all the time. Many people think about their next meal as soon as they finish with the one that they're eating, and we socialize over it. We love it. We enjoy it. We talk. But as you say, we don't somehow we don't rank it with oxygen. I mean, maybe it's not quite as important as oxygen. You die faster without oxygen, but we don't ask what it's for, where it comes from, how it's made, and so on. We don't take it seriously enough. We don't take the consequences of the way we do agriculture seriously enough. I'm sure we'll get to that. I just wanted to start there. But that's kind
No,
of the
good.
main theme of the book. Before there was agriculture, there was very little, if any, social stratification. And even if there was, it was because I was tougher than you or whatever. It wasn't inherited wealth. It wasn't inherited social stature. Um, Once there was agriculture, people could start accumulating surplus. Once people started accumulating surplus, they could become traders, they could become business people. There became a society where not everybody was a farmer, and stratification, social stratification began. Fast forward, say, 9,500 years out of the 10,000 years we're talking about. I mean, fast forward to, say, the Middle Ages or the 1500 or so, and land started to be used for cash crops. And noblemen, and they were mostly men, started taking land away from peasants and dictating to peasants what they could grow and saying, we want you to grow things we can sell. And here you can have this little plot of land on the side. We hope you can sustain you and your family on that. And food began to be traded. We saw the rise of capitalism and later industrialization. We saw the rise of commodity crops, which meant that food was being grown not to nourish people, not to feed farmers and their families and their neighbors and their areas, but to be sold. And what ultimately developed, where we're at now, is a system where everybody is supposed to grow as much as they can of what they grow well. So the United States, grows corn and soybeans and animal products well. We do that. We sell it on the open market. We get cash. We buy food from wherever else it's from, presumably from places that grow it well. This is sort of theoretically, I mean, this is neoliberalism, really. You do what you do best. And you enter
Wait
the
a second.
world economy.
Mark, you're trying to sell me this, but you don't believe this.
No, I don't believe that this is the way it ought to work, but this is the way that it is working. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. This is the way that
yeah.
it's developed. I'm not saying this is a good thing. This is where we're at. We've lost the ability to sustain ourselves, as the early days of COVID showed. We've lost the ability to sustain our regions, and I think one of the benefits of COVID, or one of the upsides of COVID, is that we've seen the importance of regional agriculture, of local agriculture. CSAs are selling out, farmers markets are crowded, and so on, because people understand that local food systems are something we can rely upon if we encourage their growth. So it's a mouthful. It's a lot to say.
Well, it is. But one way to read this book actually is as a critique of capitalism and classism. In other words, you write at one point, food security isn't an agricultural issue, it's a political one. Hunger isn't a symptom of non-production, it's a symptom of inequality, of abuse of power and wealth. For those of us who are watching but haven't read the book, explain what you mean here.
I mean, there are no hungry people with money. It's pretty simple, really. You will say, you think of the poorest country you can think of, or the poorest place on earth, or whatever it is. If I send you there with $500, you'll eat just fine. I mean, this is about power. This is about equality. Hunger is about money. And what's happening now is that the United States, and joined by multinational corporations from around the world, would like the whole world to enter into that kind of market that I was talking about before, where no one grows crops for themselves, their family, their area. Everyone grows crops to sell on the world market. That is not a sustainable system. And that is not a system that's what the Green Revolution was about. And the Green Revolution was really a form of neocolonialism. It was the United States saying, we're going to convert you to our style of agriculture so you can buy chemicals, you can buy tractors, you can buy hybridized seed, you can buy other types of technology from our corporations, and we'll benefit from that. We don't care whether you benefit or not. Very little about contemporary agriculture has either the benefit of either the farmer or the eater. The eater is a distant third. Profits come first, farmers come second, eaters take what you can get. And that's not what food was supposed to be for, or what food is supposed to be for.
Yeah, I mean, one of the parts of your book, as you critique capitalism, you infer that by having people grow specialized things and then feed it into the wider market and then buy from that wider market, that creates a space for the middle person, the middleman we used to call it, who, for doing that work, of course, extracts a profit. And at the same, and not so many paragraphs later, you point out that at its heart, economic growth is and the capitalistic system that we have right now is predicated on ever growing. But that's, at the end of the day, that's not realistic. You can't keep expanding and expanding on a finite planet.
Right. What is it? Neither matter nor energy can be created or destroyed. There's only a finite amount of stuff. So permanent growth it's a myth. It's a very pleasant myth. If we keep growing, then everybody will eventually prosper. But we can't keep growing. There's a limited amount of land. We've reached the limit of arable land. There's a limited amount of resources, potassium, phosphorus, nitrogen's virtually unlimited, but we have to figure out, it's not just in food, obviously, it's in many walks of life. We have to figure out how to be sustainable, how we can endure as a big family of let's say a stable 7 to 10 billion person family. It's not going to get bigger than that, but we can support that number of people on this earth if we're smart. If we believe in permanent growth, everybody just gets more and more and more, then we can.
I think the food system believes in permanent growth of people's waistlines, especially in the ghetto, because you point out that at one point the Small Business Administration was willing to lend in brown and black neighborhoods, but they lent for, and I'll let you finish.
They lent for the development of fast food and, of course, gas stations. Gas stations are very important, and the parallels between food and transportation, which I go into a little bit, are fascinating. There could be a whole book about that. But yeah, the SBA very cynically said, we're going to help inner city people, code word for Black and brown people. We're going to help inner city people develop businesses, but the kind of business we're going to encourage are Burger King and McDonald's, essentially, which was what was around in the 70s and 80s. And this happened simultaneously with those fast food companies realizing that business by foot was just as good, if not better, than business by car. And that urban areas, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there wasn't a McDonald's in New York. Now there are hundreds, if not thousands. Urban areas are obviously wealthy pickings for fast food companies.
And they have what you call UPCs, ultra processed, I'm sorry, UPS, ultra
UPS, yeah.
processed food. Yes, ultra processed foods, which are addictive, right? I mean, the flavor meisters make things like the potato chip, the fried chicken that you get at fast food, the burgers. They're loaded with chemicals that have been developed in laboratories to addict us to them.
Yeah.
To them.
I mean, UPF, ultra processed food, is becoming sort of the catchword for junk, the kind of more formal catchword for junk. Junk food is really food that was invented beginning in the late 19th century, but really invented in post-war America in the 20th century. And one way to define junk food really is that it doesn't exist in nature and didn't exist before the 20th century. That's one easy way to look at it. Michael Moss, a former colleague of mine from the Times, has a new book, who wrote a book called Salt, Sugar, Fat, which was a great book and a Pulitzer Prize winner. But his new book is called Hooked, and it is a study of the addictive qualities of ultra-processed foods, how food engineers, psychologists, and marketers have banded together to make ultra-processed foods literally addictive, if not on the same level as caffeine, heroin, and nicotine, very, very close to that. And as anyone who's tried to stop eating sugar can tell you, there is a physical craving when you try to stop eating sugar. I mean, you will feel it. It's not an easy thing to do.
Indeed. And the flip side, famine, you write that the old colonial system, imperialism, let's call it in this case, was also a catalyst for hunger. I mean, we think of the food deserts today in inner city areas where it's tough for people to get really good food. But in India, you raised the example of the British causing famine there. I mean, this goes way back. Tell me more about that.
Well, the first political famine, there were always famines. But there would be 2 famines a century, 4 famines a century. After colonialism, there would be 4 famines a decade. And part of it was that the mother country, at first this was usually a Western European country, later on it was others, but you think of Spain, but you think of Portugal, you think of Holland, but primarily you think of Great Britain. The mother country would plunder the colonies and send so much stuff back to the mother country that they would literally cause shortages of food and then do nothing about it. So the most famous of these is the Irish potato famine, which is not really the fault of either the Irish or the potato, but the fault of the British for taking land away from the Irish, taking their own land away from them, and using it to raise beef to send across the Irish Sea back to England. That shrunk the proportion of land that the Irish could use to feed themselves, so that they were literally subsisting on potatoes. Half the population ate something like 10 pounds of potatoes a day, or potatoes for every meal, and certainly potatoes at every meal. And when the potato blight hit, there was no alternative. There was no other food. And the British, rather than saying, gee, look what we've done, let's help these people, said, well, this is God's way, or some other, nonsensical Adam Smith kind of early capitalist stuff. They did the same thing in India later on. They did the same thing elsewhere. The French did it in West Africa and in Vietnam. I mean, it's not just Western Europeans. The biggest politically caused famines in history were Stalin's and Mao's. So it's not that this is just capitalists doing famine, it's people using food as a weapon against their perceived enemies. So Stalin wanted to wipe out or reduce the number of peasants as quickly as he could, and Mao wanted to reduce the number of landlords as quickly as he could. So yeah, those were it's been said, and it's true, that there's nothing, all famines are political at this point. There's no reason for a famine except people using food as a weapon against other people.
Yeah, indeed, we're throwing away a third of the food that we grow and we produce. It's winding up in the dustbin. Let's bring in a question now from Brandeis. Anna Zeitz gave us a question on video, so let me ask our producers Grace and Jay to roll that tape for us. Go ahead. Yes. I don't think we're hearing this.
I'm not.
Jay, let's try again and feed the audio in if you can. Or I have a transcript of the question that we can read here.
Might be easier.
Let's see. Anna says she appreciated. Well, all right. We're going to try again. All right, let's try again.
Hi, I'm Anna from Brandeis, and I wanted to say that I really enjoyed Animal Vegetable Junk, and I especially appreciated how you address the way the issues within our food system intersect with other issues such as racism, income inequality, and immigration. And I wanted to ask if you feel hopeful that the Biden administration will be successful in fostering positive change towards a more just and sustainable food system in America. Thank you.
Okay, Mark, you're on.
Yeah, and a great question. You know, I really, it's not in my nature to be optimistic. I've been anti every administration since the Nixon administration. So, but I am optimistic. I think the initial moves of the Biden administration have been positive and have been conscious and thoughtful. I think the $3 trillion package that they're bandying about now is promising as well. I think we have to see if they have the guts to really pass progressive legislation without the help of Republicans and with the support of the majority of, it seems to me, the vast majority or big majority of the people in this country. And if they can convince enough people to maintain or even improve the majority in 2022, we may be looking at a period where we actually do make progress, not only in food, but in climate change and income inequality and so on down the line. So yes, I'm optimistic. We might be having a different discussion in 6 months, but right now I'm hopeful.
So, Mark, what about the question of meat here? You know, this nexus, of course, of us producing, as you say, export essentially of beef and the meat, both beef and pigs, and especially the stuff to feed them with here and elsewhere, it has our agricultural system tied up in some sort of crazy Gordian knot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, talk to us about meat and what do you think can be done and what do you think should be done?
Well, let me just back up to where we were 15 minutes ago or so and talk about that surplus again. When we started growing one crop at a time, it started with wheat, but now it's mostly corn and soybeans. We started growing one crop at a time. We can't eat all of that stuff. So something had to be done with it. And the three main things that are being done with these big crops. One, we don't have to talk about, that's ethanol. And the ethanol mandate, the renewable fuel standard, is ridiculous. And, you know, that would be an interesting thing for the Biden administration to tackle, but that's not a food subject. But if you want to talk about food waste, here we are wasting so much land to grow corn to make fuel that isn't even efficient. But okay, put that aside for now. The two main things that happen to corn and soybeans is they get turned into junk food and they get turned into animal feed. So we have this amazing, I mean, incalculable excess, surplus of corn and soybeans. We figure out how to raise animals and feed them those foods, which are not of course, they're not the natural foods for animals, but that's what we're feeding them. And we figure out how to grow them, how to raise them in factories, really. It's ridiculous to call them farms, in factories where we treat them as widgets. The number of animals produced in the United States every year, I mean, it's just unbelievable number. It's 60 billion. It's 60 billion with a B. So that's way more than we should eat. It's way more than we can eat. And the rest of the world is trying to catch, or much of the rest of the world is trying to catch up to us in eating that level of animals and animal products. It's not sustainable. They require too many resources, too many nutrients, too much food is being fed to animals and not fed to humans. And this it gets a little technical. It's about something called the conversion ratio. How many pounds of grain do you have to feed a cow in order for that cow to produce a pound of meat? How much water do you need to give that cow to have that cow produce a pound of meat or a pound of milk, for that matter? How much land? What happens to that land? How many resources have to go into produce meat that's not even particularly good for us on the level that we're eating it? So this is, when we talk about sustainability and we talk about, and we haven't even touched on factory farming's impact on the local environment, that is the poisons that it spews into the atmosphere, onto the soil, the carcinogens that are generated in the neighborhood of these factory farms, which, by the way, only a poor person would live in, because everybody who could afford to leave will leave or has left. Then we haven't talked about factory farming's contribution to climate change, which is profound. So all of these things make it so that the way that we produce, consume, and eat meat is unsustainable. Meat and other animal products is unsustainable. Much of that is a level of scale. I mean, if you reduce that, I think I said 60 billion, but that's the annual worldwide consumption. It's 10 billion in the United States. If you reduce that 10 billion by 20%, you're still producing a ton. I mean, a lot of meat, but you've made a significant dent in it. And there are ways we can start to slowly, I don't want to say eat away, but anyway, reduce the amount of meat that's produced and therefore eaten, and therefore its impact on the environment. So I'm sure we'll get to that, some of the things that we ought to be doing.
Well, let's talk more about that, and especially though in this world context, because one of the powers of your book is how global it is. That there are things that we do here in the United States, yes, but if you look in Europe, you look at Asia, you look in Africa, you look at Mesoamerica, there are variations on this, frankly, unsustainable theme in all these
places.
So let's. Oh my goodness, the puns are here tonight. Let's try to put our. I know, guilty as charged, but let's try to put our hooks into the meat question. And I'll throw you a bit more preface here. It's interesting how it's gotten politicized, that people in this society who raise questions about eating meat are considered probably to the left, and people who say, of course not, this is our right to eat what we want, roughly speaking, could be to the right. I mean, it's not rigid, but it I think is the ethos these days. What's to be done? You have some interesting solutions here. Let's talk about some of them.
I mean, in a way, I finished this book a year ago, and I've thought about it obviously since then, and in the last 8 weeks or so let's say 12 weeks since advanced copies went out, I've thought about it and talked about it every day for hours. And I think I know I have some things to say. I think there are a few steps that can be taken in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years that will greatly affect the way that we think about agriculture, and that will improve things in a way so that we can feel like we're on the road toward building a better food system. The question is not, can we support 7 billion people without industrial agriculture? Can we feed ourselves without? Those are not the questions. The questions right now are, how can we reduce some of the most egregious mistakes being made by big ag and big food? And the first of those, I think the first of those has to do with meat. And it's first on my list because it's the easiest to fix. And that is getting antibiotics out of routine use in feeding animals. 80% of the antibiotics in the United States that are prescribed. They're not really given by prescription, are administered, I guess, to animals. That enables factory farms to crowd animals in more than is imaginable, but even more than would be done without antibiotics. It's also bred antibiotic resistance in animals, in humans, and in bacteria, so that some tens of thousands of people every year die from antibiotic resistant infections, and that number is growing every year. So if you can still raise animals profitably, you can even still raise animals in factories if you make the routine use of antibiotics illegal. You just make it more difficult. So it's a way of both improving the system, regaining some of the efficacy of antibiotics, but making it more difficult to keep those numbers at that 10 billion level. So again, if we reduce it to 8 billion, it's still way too much, but it's something. We've done something, and we've demonstrated that change is possible. So that's at or near the top of my list is the antibiotic thing. I could go on if you like.
Well, yeah, we'll hit a couple more for us.
Okay. There are existing rules about pesticides that aren't particularly well enforced. There also ought to be new regulations about pesticides. We are subsidizing industrial agriculture. I think the least we could expect of the people who are growing our food is that they do it without carcinogenic pesticides, which are obviously the frontline workers in this case are agricultural workers, largely immigrants and people of color, all underpaid, and they're the ones who are most directly exposed to the carcinogens in the food supply. But we're all affected by that. We don't, Rachel Carson wrote about this 75 years ago. We don't want to be routinely using carcinogens in our food supply. So that would be a second thing. A third thing, and this has sort of become my project, but these are all important. But a third thing is to reduce the ability of marketers to attack children with junk food ads. And everyone watching and listening to this knows what it was like to be a kid and be convinced that Tony the Tiger was your friend, that the most fun place to eat was McDonald's, and that the best beverage of choice was Coke. We all know that we either learned that or we were messaged with that. And that messaging continues even though kids don't know the difference between right and wrong, between truth and lies. I mean, they literally don't have a brain that's developed to do that yet. And yet they're being told that Tony the Tiger is their best friend. There were some attempts at limiting the marketing of junk to children in the 70s, but when Ronald Reagan and subsequent administrations came along, that stuff ceased to be talked about. We need to talk about that. We need to not only teach our children what real food is, show them what real food is, how it's grown, where it comes from, but also limit their exposure to junk food that is ultimately going to destroy so many lives of every generation that until we start limiting that marketing.
Well, that's right, because since kids are marketed directly, and I do remember the campaigns in the 70s to try to, I guess more, towards the 70s into the 80s to try to say stop the advertising of of all sugar breakfast cereal to kids.
There were some limitations put on TV advertising on Saturday mornings and other times that kids programming was on, but there's no limits on the internet, and no one knows what the kids are watching on their screens. I mean, it's impossible to know that. So you'd have to be looking over their shoulder at every moment.
And the way that I think it works for kids these days is if they are discouraged to not have the Mickey D's, to not have the ultra processed food when they ask for it, they feel that they're being penalized. I feel like they're being penalized by the parents. And conversely, a number of parents see that as an appropriate reward. Well, if Tyrone and Letitia are really good, then you could go to KFC.
It's look, at this point, the generations that don't remember being targeted with that kind of marketing as children are dying off. My mother's generation is my mother's 95. Hers is the last generation that didn't grow up with that kinds of marketing. Mine is essentially, I'm 70, mine is essentially the first generation that grew up with a lot of that kind of marketing. So we've all suffered from that. Everybody knows, I think I said this before, but everybody knows how hard it is to change your diet. And one of the reasons it's so hard to change your diet is that your preferences were formed when you were too young to know the difference. So none of us, or very few of us, know farmers now. Very few of us get to a place where real food is actually grown. It's so wonderful that there are farmers markets and that they're increasing in number, and that people can take their kids and take themselves to a farmer's market and actually interact with the farmer. But there's not enough of that, and there's no formal education around food in our schools. And until there is, then kids are not going to learn what real food is, where it comes from, how to eat it, how to appreciate it. They're going to get their information about food from, as you say, Mickey D's and the other fast food companies and pushers of ultra processed foods or junk, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and we mentioned the addictive nature of these junk foods, and of course addiction is associated initially with pleasure, right? I mean, people at least start these behaviors thinking, oh, it makes me feel better, I feel good. We have a question actually from one of the students at Brandeis that I'd like to bring in, Orly Strobel. Let me ask Grace and Jay if you could roll Orly's question here.
Hi, my name is Orly. In your conversation with Ezra Klein on his podcast, you share that your primary concerns are ensuring equitable access to foods that are both nourishing and grown under environmentally conscious conditions rather than necessarily ensuring that foods bring pleasure. I wonder if you could speak on the role of pleasure in helping people build and maintain culture and community in their food systems.
Thanks for that. We're losing that. I mean, if we have to learn our pleasures from marketers, then we're going to be addicted to food that's not good for us. If we learn our pleasures from food that the earth produces from tradition, from our own culture's traditions, from each other's culture's traditions, then we can learn to appreciate food. I don't discount the importance of deliciousness in food, but I question the value of engineered deliciousness as opposed to natural deliciousness. Every single culture that has moved away from a traditional diet has seen an increase in chronic disease. That is universal, that's indisputable, that is truth. Every single traditional diet is healthier than the standard current American diet, or whatever you want to call it. 60% of our calories now come from ultra processed foods. Someone's eating that stuff. You may eat less, I may eat less. That means someone else is eating more. Deliciousness is subjective. You start to believe what's delicious when you're young. Again, it goes back to teaching our kids how to appreciate real foods, what a carrot is, where it comes from. the beauty of the earth, the beauty of the way that things grow, as opposed to the lure of what we're marketed, what we're sold. And so I think deliciousness is a little tricky because it's, in a way, it's a learned trait.
Well, and one has to, to look, as you pointed out, over time, as we have really gone into the cities relatively rapidly over history, and lost that connection, many of us, from actually growing our own food. There's that other set of pleasures that comes for when you plant something and then you get to harvest it and you get to eat it. That brings a very powerful type of pleasure that is frankly much healthier for us, I would say.
Yeah, I think I think there are people who want to grow and want to farm who are shut out from this because land is so expensive, and most land is owned uh, in large chunks, mostly by white men, mostly who are the descendants of people who got that land during the Homestead, after the Homestead Act in the 19th century. We have to figure out a way to get land into the hands of people who want to farm it and farm it well. We have to restore dignity to farming. We have to use the technology that we have to make farming less grueling and less difficult than it used to be, but not to make it so that it's entirely mechanized and so that we're only growing one crop at a time at great cost to our health and the health of the soil and ultimately the planet. This is all, as you said at the outset of this conversation, this is all tied in together. This is not just a question of how you eat and how good is it for you, although those things are important. This is a question of how we grow and how we choose to grow. What, as we said at the beginning, what is food for?
What is food for? There was there's an anecdote in here about Mr. Heinz, Henry Heinz, the ketchup dude. What was his role in changing the future of processed foods in this country, and how are we living with those decisions today?
Um, it's funny, Henry Heinz was in part instrumental in getting the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 passed, which was our first food labeling law. And he did that by taking a chemical called sodium benzoate out of ketchup and in part substituting sugar for that. But the point was that he gained a competitive advantage by doing that, and by then questioning why there was sodium benzoate in all of his competitors' ketchups, while helping the federal government, pass a law that said you had to disclose all your ingredients on your label, including sodium benzoate. Obviously, sodium benzoate, it turns out, is harmless, but that's besides the point.
A little less
Ever
addictive
since
than a little less addictive than sugar as
less
well,
addictive
right?
than sugar, right? Less harmful
Yeah.
than sugar too. Um, but ever since then, manufacturers have manipulated the labeling laws and manipulated government attempts to try to limit damaging aspects of food. And we see that every time the government makes nutritional recommendations, eat less fat, eat more fiber, and so on. We see labeling that is, this food is low fat or this food is high fiber. The point is not whether manufacturers can take out or put in the undesirable or more desirable ingredients. The point is manufacturers have no interest in providing us with real food. They have interest in providing us with value-added food that's been manipulated and hyper-processed and so on. And they can do that to almost any nutritional standard that the government chooses to name. So until the government recognizes that this begins, until we recognize and force the government to act that on the notion that this begins with agriculture, this begins with growing real food, this begins with growing food to eat, as opposed to food to hyper process and turn into things that aren't recognizable as food. Until then, we're going to have a sick food system. We're going to have a system that engenders chronic disease and ultimately causes premature death.
Yes, early on in your book, you point out that as societies made the transition into ag, people literally became shorter and less healthy. You want to talk a little bit about that? I mean, we all, since we're all in this together, we look around and we see everybody looks about the same and everything, but actually there's been quite a difference over the years.
I mean, there were a number of turning points in the course of history that if people knew then what we know now might have gone differently. And there's an argument. Jared Diamond put it forward first, I think. Yuval Harari does it in *Sapiens* also, and I echo it to some extent. And that argument is that agriculture, the development of agriculture, could be seen as a mistake because and there's evidence, as you just said, that hunter and gatherers were much healthier, much stronger than every generation of humans until about the 20th century. So, but here's the thing: we know that we've made mistakes in history, and we know that we can't go back and fix them. What we can do is try to make those mistakes right. And what we can do is use the knowledge that we have now to try to do things better going forward. We have way more knowledge than we've ever had. Do we have the political will? Do we have the intent to try to do things right, to try to work together as a community, to try to structure food so that it's affordable and available and accessible to everybody, not just the people with lots of money? To try to structure agriculture so that it's less damaging to the earth, so that we don't have this incredible moral dilemma of raising and killing billions of animals that we basically torture from birth till death. Can we make those kinds of decisions, and can we implement those kinds of decisions? I feel like I should turn a light on because it's like I'm starting to be saving. I'm an hour ahead of you, so just give me 10 seconds here.
Okay.
A little better, right? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, here it comes. I know you knew that this question was going to come.
Uh-oh.
So much of what you've been talking about is industrialized agriculture. Our modern version of the enclosures that hit the surf, our modern version of the slave system that hit people, back in the day in the ancient civilizations. So, what does decentralized agriculture look like? What will a decentralized agricultural system look like? And how do we get there? How do we do it? How do we get there?
I don't know what it will look like. I mean, I have some notions, but they're just notions. No one knows what the world is going to look like in 50 years, and no one 50 years ago predicted what it would look like now. So I think the things that I said before are steps to put us on the road toward building a better food system. But it's not just about food. It's about strengthening democracy. It's about enabling more people to vote and talking to more people about voting. It's about building community. It's about organizing communities. Food is an important issue. And in a way, I've come to feel like my job is to say, it's not just about climate change. It's not just about inequality. It's just not just about the environment, racism, gender discrimination. All those things are super, super important. Let's elevate food to the realm of those other things, and let's put it in the mix and talk about it, because it's something that everybody can agree on. Everybody can easily agree that we ought to have good food and that everybody ought to be able to eat it. So it has to be done regionally. The supply chain needs to be shorter. We need to have smaller farms, more regional food system. These are things that we're pretty sure we're going to be seeing. Fewer pesticides, more agroecology or regenerative farming, whatever you want to call that. But we have to start with organizing, talking about this, strengthening democracy, doing the few steps like reining in pesticides, reining in factory farms, reining in the use of antibiotics, teaching our children how to eat. Those are getting farmland into the hands of people who want to farm it well. These are sort of first steps. When we've started on this road, we'll be able to see what happens next on it. We'll never see the end of it. Change is permanent. We know that. So what it looks like 50 or 100 years from now, I don't know. I almost don't care. I want to know what we can do in the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years to put us on that road so that 50 years from now, things are better, not worse.
And say more about agroecology. Not everybody listening to us or watching us is familiar with the way you
No,
describe it
no
in the
one
book.
is. And one of the great things about agroecology, which is just a mashup of agriculture and ecology, is that it's such a terrible word that it has a chance of not being co-opted by big food. I mean, can you see cereal boxes that say 100% agroecologically grown? I mean, that might be a little tricky. Whereas organic was an easy one to. But agroecology acknowledges the need for short-term change. Let's say organic principles, reduced pesticides, better soil health, better treatment of animals, uh, fewer genetically engineered products, and so on down the line. But it acknowledges that those are just first steps in getting land back into the hands of people, of building a just and equitable food system, and of building a just and equitable society. Because ecology recognizes that we are one family. Ecology recognizes that we all live on the earth and that we have to protect the earth, love the earth, embrace the earth, help the earth survive. Those are important things. And it's not just a question of, do I eat organic food or do I eat less meat or whatever? It's a question of justice. It's a question of equality. It's a question of fairness. It's a question of sustainability. Those are sort of the big issues. And agroecology, unlike organic, agroecology recognizes that this is the progression. We start by doing what we can to build a better food system. It's just what I was saying about getting on this road to building a better food system. It may start small, but it's about building community. It's about organizing. It's about strengthening democracy, better voting rights, and so on down the line.
We're just about out of time here, but what I'd like to do is to hear from Lyle James on this point. If Grace and Jay can cue him up and roll it, be great.
From Brandeis University. Hello, I'm Lyle from Brandeis University, and I was thinking, I agree with your premise that, as you put it, producers ultimately determine what people eat, but consumer choice is undeniably a factor too. How do we counter the likelihood that as standards of living rise around the world, people will want to consume more meat rather than less?
So there it is. The incentive for the agroecology situation um, can be missed by the individual.
We are talking about individual change and we are talking about societal change. So we can do what we can to protect the individual. That's government's job, is to protect the individual from business. And government is not doing that work. Yes, it's true that every generation of every society, almost every generation of almost every society on Earth that was able to eat more animal products did eat more animal products. But they didn't know that that wasn't going to be sustainable in the 21st century, and it's not sustainable now. So as we have to make sacrifices to protect the planet from the climate crisis, I mean, everybody wants a car also, but everybody can't have a car. And everybody can't eat meat at the rate that Americans, Australians, British, New Zealanders, etc., do now. That means we need to eat less as other people eat more. We are one family. This is one planet. We can't even sustain the number of animals that are being grown and slaughtered worldwide now. We certainly can't sustain it if other countries begin to eat meat at the rate that we're eating meat. So as other people eat more meat, it's important for us to eat less, not in order for them to eat more, but for ourselves and for the planet.
So, what makes you smile in the morning when you get up? You know about all these problems with food, and I don't envy you, by the way, because anytime you are invited to somebody's house to eat, they have to recognize that you may have comments to make about them. And of course, anytime you invite somebody over to your house to eat, you have to recognize that your guests are likely to say, "Well, why are you feeding me this?" So, But what are a couple of things that really make you smile, help you get up in the morning, knowing what you know about, frankly, how much trouble we are in right now over our food system. It's not sustainable. We're getting famines. We're having these food deserts. People are really getting sick. Um, what makes you optimistic? I know you said at the outset that you're congenitally maybe pessimistic, but
Right.
you keep writing and you've gone even from cookbooks to write this wonderful book. So something has to have you optimistic, and it is
Hopeful rather than optimistic. And I'm grateful that I get to talk about this stuff. I mean, and I'm not flattering you. I'm grateful to be in this conversation. I am fortunate enough to have had the opportunity to say what I think, to think about, to get paid really, to make a living trying to figure out what's wrong with food and how to make it better, and then to have people want me to talk about that and write about that. That's a fabulous opportunity. If when I was 20 years old, you told me that 50 years later, that's what I would be doing, I would have been ecstatic about that. So I'm doing good work. I have a good life. That makes me smile. And I'm doing good work. And that makes me really happy. So that's an easy answer in a way. It doesn't mean that I'm not Pollyannish, but I'm not going to be depressed and cynical either. So I like to think that I'm trying to make a difference, and that makes it worthwhile.
perfect. And what are some of the signs then that give you hope? What do you observe that then feeds your hope?
Well, I do think, we saw increased appreciation for the regional food system during COVID. And I think the fact that almost every CSA in the country has sold out for 2021 and many have sold out for 2022, the fact that farmers markets are more active and busier than ever, the fact that more young people want to get into farming than ever, the fact that more people living in cities are organizing around food, are relating to farmers near their cities, are supporting urban agriculture. All of these things, I think, are really, really good signs. Um, I think the fact that the Justice for Black Farmers Act, 2 months ago, if you had said to me, what are the things we should be doing right now? I would say one of the things we should be doing is helping the few existing Black farmers in the United States. And that happened in the COVID Relief Act. It didn't happen in an ideal way, but it happened in a way that hasn't happened before. And that's, some good things are happening. So I'm happy about that.
Well, I want to thank you. The book, of course, is called Animal, Vegetable, Junk. See, is the camera seeing this appropriately?
And the spork.
And the sport. Yes, the sport. The subtitle is A History of Food from Sustainable to Suicidal. And the author, of course, has been our guest today, Mark Bittman. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time with us today.
It's great, Steve. Thank you for your thoughtful interview. It's good to see you.
So, and I want to thank everybody for who's coming, who's been watching this. And let me just remind those of you who are watching, if you enjoyed this event, you might want to consider supporting what we do on Living on Earth. You can go to our website. That's loe.org. We are a listener-supported show, and your contribution will make a difference, whether you give us $5 or 5 million or something in between. Because every little bit helps, and in moving forward consciousness on issues that, in fact, we're not powerless to deal with food. There are things that we can do collectively to make a difference, as well as individual choices. Because, as Mark pointed out, it's kind of hard for one person at a time to do this at the supermarket, even yelling at the manager at the supermarket. But on the other hand, when a neighborhood organizes and has an urban garden or works together, that does make a difference. So please let us know what you thought of this event, this little survey that you can look at that will come up when we finish. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thanks, Mark, for literally putting a light on this, as you did at the end. And keep on writing and keeping us informed on this, because the last time I looked, oh yeah, I have another meal coming up sometime, at least.
Boom.
Yeah, so we all eat, and we might as well make it something positive in our lives and our society's life. So thank you all, and good night.
Thanks, Steve.